Thank you for your interest in the Jason Foundation Incorporated, JFI, and our programs for awareness and prevention of youth suicide. All of the Jason Foundation's programs have been designed to follow the guidelines of our mission statement, dedicated to the prevention of the silent epidemic of youth suicide, through educational and awareness programs that equip young people, educators/youth workers, and parents with the tools and resources to help identify and assist at-risk youth. Since the time these materials were produced, our affiliates, community partners, etc. may have changed, bringing more diversity and support to JFI. For an up-to-date list of our supporters, please visit the JFI website, www.jasonfoundation.com. Also, statistical information supplied in these programs may be different from when the programs were first filmed. For updated national and state statistics, please visit the Centers for Disease Control, CDC website at www.cdc.gov. You will find a wealth of knowledge about suicide and specifically youth suicide on their website. If you are facilitating a presentation using the enclosed materials, please share the above information with your audience. Periodically, we may add a section to the videos supplying updates. Again, thank you for joining in the fight against youth suicide.
Hello, my name is Scott Poland. I'm really pleased to be here with my good friend Richard Lieberman. We're going to be talking about a very important topic today, how educators need to be involved in helping identify students that are suffering from depression. I have a long history of working in the schools and believe very strongly we must identify students that are suffering from depression early on in elementary school and all the way through adolescence to make sure that they get the help that they need. It's a very common problem for teenagers in particular. They often suffer from depression. In fact, the literature says about 20% of teens suffer from depression during those tumultuous years. And we're going to talk today about how do we distinguish teen depression from adult depression, what do we look for, what do we do, what are the most important treatments that can actually alleviate depression. And at any given time, think of it this way, about 8% of adolescents in any classroom in America today are suffering from depression. About 2% of elementary students at any given time are depressed. And as I've already mentioned, 1 in 5 suffer from depression as a teenager at some point. More boys are diagnosed with depression than girls. Twice as many girls, are depressed with depression as boys. You probably all heard about bipolar disorder, which is the one most associated with suicidal behavior. It's the most associated with non-suicidal self-injury. And bipolar disorder involves some really dramatic changes in behavior, where sometimes the young person is extremely low and depressed. Other times they're in a manic phase and very agitated. For the most part, the low and the depressive state is the most common with bipolar. And depression can coexist with a lot of other disorders, according to the Diagnostic Statistics Manual 5, which is things like substance abuse and conduct disorder. And I'd be remiss today not to mention that, first and foremost, alcohol is a depressant. When you already have a problem with depression, going out and getting drunk certainly does not help. And moving on again, I want to give you an example. Kayla, 14-year-old girl. She previously had good grades at school, but all of a sudden she's failing her classes. Her parents report that she's sleeping a lot. She may not even be eating very much. She's isolating herself in her room. She recently dropped out of dance class, which has been something that has been of high interest and a very pleasurable activity for Kayla for many years. Oh, and in her writing class, she turned in themes of death and suicide. Now, what do we want to have happen in a situation like this? We want all the adults in her life to be alert. And as I described, Kayla has dropped out of pleasurable activities. This is pervasive because her parents are reporting that this has gone on for several weeks now. And it also might be affecting all aspects of her life. The one piece of information you don't have would have to do with social life. So we'd really need to know, how is Kayla getting on with peers right now? Is this persistent? Is it pervasive? And has she dropped out of previously pleasurable activities? Teen depression is often misunderstood. And part of our goal today is to give you correct information and to separate what's different about teen depression from adult depression. And no, teens don't have a lack of willpower when they're depressed and having trouble with their energy level and follow through. And no, it is not just typical teenage behavior and moodiness. Sometimes parents have said to me, oh, she's preparing me for she's going off to college next year. That's why she is so difficult. Well, again, back to emphasizing, is this affecting all aspects of her life? Is this persistent, having gone on for several weeks? That is when we really need to be moving towards identification of depression and getting professional help. But unfortunately, there's a lot of stigma associated with depression. And sometimes in our families, we're very hesitant to seek out counseling and psychological help. And teen depression does differ from adult depression. More about that in just a moment with the next slide. And sometimes we think about teen depression, is it magnified during the holiday times in December? But in reality, that is not a time when teen depression is particularly noticeable or magnified. Often in our families and our communities, medication can be viewed negatively. And we want to give you good information today about those medications and their possible benefits. How do they differ from adults when adults suffer from depression? Well, teenagers do have more irritability, more angry moods and outbursts. They might have somatic complaints. We might have a teenager who is having problems with attendance at school. They may be in the nurse's office frequently, and they have these unexplained aches and pains. And actually, often, they do see the family physician for these medical concerns. We obviously want a family physician who's going to also be alert and be direct in asking about signs of depression and even thoughts of suicide. That teenager might be especially sensitive to criticism. And in the family and school, there may be things that previously wouldn't have bothered them, but now, today, because they're depressed, they get extremely upset. It may be even just the slightest thing that's said to them. They may be withdrawing. They may be pulling away from what has previously been the group of students in school they spent the most time with. They might be withdrawing from activities. As I mentioned in the example, Kayla suddenly wasn't interested in dance, something that she had really loved her entire life. Teen depression tends to have a cluster of symptoms. We've gone over a number of those already: the irritability, the moodiness, the persistence having gone on for several weeks, being pervasive, affecting not just school performance, but family life and social relationships as well. And I think it's really important that we stress today that anyone can be depressed. And we've already estimated that about 20% of teens do suffer from depression at some point. And being depressed is certainly not a sign of weakness. And as we talk a little more today, we're going to talk about the biological origins that are involved with depression. Depression can run in families. And having worked as a psychologist for all those years, it's actually really helpful when a mom or a dad will confidentially share with us that they have suffered from depression. So it's no big surprise that it does tend to run in families, and that if families are aware of depression and the history, then they're hopefully going to be more amenable to treatment. So it is linked to the brain and different brain chemicals. Neurotransmitters play a role. Serotonin as well as norepinephrine also play a role with regards to depression. Major depression, we're now looking at some of the diagnosis from the DSM-5. Major depression tends to have very intense symptoms, but shorter in duration. Dysthymia has less intense symptoms, but it has gone on for a much longer period of time. And earlier I did mention bipolar disorder, which has to do with the more dramatic changes in mood. It involves that manic or agitated stage, but it also involves a lot of lows and a lot of really not having energy, not having interest in things, and really being in those lows of depression. So now I'd like to turn it over to my colleague and friend, Mr. Lieberman.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Once again, I'm Rich Lieberman. I've been a school psychologist for about 40 years. And for 25 of those years, I coordinated suicide prevention for Los Angeles Unified School District. Los Angeles Unified School District is the second largest school district in America. Our program was in over 1,100 schools and covered the nearly 1 million students of Los Angeles. And just to give you a little perspective, today we are filming in Nashville, and the population of students in my school district was more than 1.5 times the entire population of Nashville. So it's an extraordinary, extraordinary population to work with. I want to thank Jason Foundation for inviting me today. I recently retired, but that has now left me a lot more time for my other 3 jobs, which all involve a passion of mine, which is suicide prevention. So I want to thank the Jason Foundation for having me today and for allowing me to present with my good friend and colleague, Dr. Scott Poland. With any crisis in the schools, we must look at it through 2 lenses, a developmental lens and a cultural lens. So culturally responsive crisis intervention involves knowing the diverse students that you have in your classrooms, understanding what depression may mean within their culture, having materials for parents to raise awareness, but having those materials in native languages. And whenever Scott and I present, we always work with the hearing impaired population and working with translators as well and interpreters for us to maximize receiving the information. Teachers are so critical in this process. So we are certainly appreciative that the Jason Foundation reaches out to the teachers of the United States. So Scott has told you a little bit about how depression differs from in children from adult populations, but depression also differs between children and between adolescents. So just to review some of the points that Scott raised already, this is not a weakness or a flaw in kids, and unlike many adults think kids can just snap out of it, and that is very difficult to do. It's more than just feeling sad. It's a mood disorder that affects all aspects of a child's life, how they think, how they feel, and how they behave. The estimates are, by the end of the tumultuous teen years, about 1 in 5 kids will have suffered from depression at some point. And the important thing is that the majority of these students do not receive any treatment. And without treatment, oftentimes, depression can lead to other kinds of problems like substance abuse, academic failure, and even thoughts of suicide. What are some of the risk factors for depression? Well, right at the top of the list is the trauma pool that each child within your classroom kind of comes in with every day. The traumatic events that they have suffered somewhere in their lives. And the research shows that when these traumatic events may put a child in a life-threatening situation, have a child witness or observe a fatality or injuries, that these can be the kinds of events that may lead to an episode of major depression. For kids, one of the major risk factors is the experience of loss. And certainly when a student will lose a member of a family, a peer, a friend, someone in the community, this can have a tremendous impact on the student. The 3 top losses, of course, when a death occurs, it's traumatic, but when a death occurs by suicide within a child's life, it can have extraordinary impact. However, this is not the most dramatic loss that kids suffer, adolescents in particular. There is a loss of dignity when kids are bullied or harassed or publicly humiliated. And then, probably at the top of the list, would be the boyfriend-girlfriend breakup. Certainly that's something adults minimize, but for young people, these can be some of the most traumatic losses. ADHD, attention deficit hyperactive disorder. I do believe that the fact here, and the one thing we want to make clear, is that not all children with ADHD get depressed or have episodes of suicidal thought. It's very important that we make that distinction. But one of the critical risk factors for youth is impulsivity. And within the ADHD diagnosis, impulsivity is a part of the spectrum for young people. Another risk factor is conduct problems, and that is particularly when we're looking at our boys. So if one population in particular that we have to be concerned about is our ED boys, our emotionally disturbed boys in special ed classes. Scott mentioned that depression often doesn't work alone, that oftentimes there are multiple risk factors. We call that comorbidity, when 2 risk factors affect a child at the same time. There are different profiles for boys and girls. For girls, depression and substance abuse raises risk exponentially. And what we mean by that, they're synergistic, which means that risk is greater than adding up the 2 risk factors. In other words, the combination of them take the risk to a whole new level. And for boys in particular, it is depression and conduct disorder. As a matter of fact, some of the statistics are very high. Almost 45% of ED boys that are comorbid between depression and conduct disorder will make a suicide attempt before they leave high school. Also, as Scott mentioned, there's a family history of depression, which can have impact on a child, and uncertainty about sexual orientation and identity. Kids who are struggling with their sexual orientation, particularly during the time of adolescence when they are considering coming out, are at their greatest risk for depression. And a growing population in America that's very high risk are our military veterans and family of our veterans. So if a child is in a home that is torn apart by a parent going to a foreign war somewhere, this kind of loss, this kind of stress can cause depression. Let's take a look at some of the symptoms of teen depression. Now, remember we said it's more than sad, so that these are the kinds of symptoms. In order to be diagnosed with depression, these symptoms must last for a period of longer than 2 weeks, but they must also have an impact on daily functioning for our students. So as Scott mentioned, a persistent sad and irritable mood, a sense of hopelessness, and particularly hopelessness concerns Scott and I a great deal, because being depressed is a risk factor for suicide, but having a sense of hopelessness is actually a warning sign when kids will see no hope that their lives will change, and they feel they have no power to change any of the circumstances in their life. As Scott mentioned, as typical with adults, there is a lack of energy, anhedonia, which is a term that describes a lack of enthusiasm for life or life kinds of events. And very common in kids who are depressed, we will see changes in their appetite and in their sleeping patterns. Sometimes they will stay in bed, and then sometimes they won't go to bed. Sometimes they will not be eating, sometimes they will be overeating. But very simple tasks of nutrition and getting enough rest. And there is an awful lot of research now coming out on sleeplessness and its impact on kids. Scott and I have both promoted school districts considering the time that the schools start during the course of the day. Sometimes classes begin at 7 o'clock in the morning, and I see there are students in our audience today that are just shaking their heads yes, because it seems like there is no time to sleep. You're up late at night studying, and then up first thing in the morning to go to school. One of the things that distinguishes youth depression from adult depression is what we call masked depression. Masked depression doesn't look like depression in kids, the symptoms that we just talked about. Masked depression are actually things kids do to try to feel better. And they generally are very poor coping kinds of skills. For example, alcohol and substance abuse can have a tremendous impact on depression, as well as non-suicidal self-injury. Now, the Jason Foundation has materials to help raise awareness about non-suicidal self-injury. This is a topic that has been evolving over the last decade in terms of research. Scott and I have written extensively about it, and I believe our first chapter a decade ago was called Self-Mutilation. Our second chapter was called Self-Injury. And our third was non-suicidal self-injury, actually building into the title that kids do not engage in this behavior as a form of suicide attempt, but they are actually cutting or burning to feel better. We do see different symptoms in elementary school kids. We see a wider array of symptoms in addition to cutting, picking, poking, head banging, hair pulling. ways that they try to self-medicate. By the time we get into adolescence and high school, about 3 out of 4 of those that engage in non-suicidal self-injury are females. And 75% of the time they will choose either cutting or burning, so it narrows as kids get older. How does it make a kid feel better? Well, as the student cuts superficially, the brain perceives that the body is in crisis and immediately dumps endorphins into the blood system. Those endorphins will make, if a teacher confronts a student or talks to a student about their cutting and asks innocently, "Doesn't that hurt?" a teacher is more likely to hear a response along the lines of, "No, I feel a sense of relief or release." And that is the impact of the brain secreting those endorphins to try to make the child feel better. There are other kinds of risky behaviors, such as drinking and driving, playing with guns, or a risky behavior in elementary schools in particular is the choking game, where kids try to mimic what the media has described as choking to get high. And that's by depriving the brain of oxygen. We do not go into the details of the choking game because we do not want to educate kids about it, but we want to raise awareness amongst all teachers and all educators. It's a time maybe to revisit the hickey on a kid's neck. It may be a black and blue mark, and it may be indicating that this child is engaging in the choking game, either with other students or, and most dangerously, engaging in the choking game, playing by themselves. That is when it can be completely and extremely dangerous. Teachers must look out for sudden changes in behavior. When a teacher says to me on our hotline in LAUSD, "This behavior is not like this child at all," that jumps out to a hotline operator. So our educators are extremely important in identifying sudden changes in behavior. And once again, if a student is left without treatment for depression, it can certainly lead to suicidal thoughts. Let's look at this through a developmental lens. What are some of the symptoms of childhood depression? Because younger children tend to express their crisis non-verbally or behaviorally. They don't necessarily talk about their troubles. So they tend to somaticize or have many vague physiological problems. So this would be the headache, the fever, the stomach ache. This would be a student that maybe would be referred to the nurse's office quite frequently. Sometimes this results in absences from school, and sometimes these behavior problems can involve what we call regression, particularly for younger children. So they'll slip a developmental milestone. So all of a sudden a parent may talk about, "Well, she went back to sucking her thumb," or "He is having a problem with bedwetting now." Again, he's having difficulty separating from me and going to school, when the child had previously attained these kinds of milestones. So that's indicative of follow-up, this kind of regressive behavior. Also, and very important in school, we see a drop in academic achievement and a drop in grades, and sometimes in written samples or drawing, in particularly for younger students in elementary school, these can have suicidal themes in drawings. So for a diagnosis of depression, just to review, the symptoms must persist for a period of 2 weeks or longer, and it must impact the daily functioning. And the most important thing is to help, for the educator, is to help get this student to help and the help that they need. This will give us an idea of the incidence of depression. The Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance Survey is a national survey that's done every 2 years by the federal government, and they look into all kinds of risky behaviors. It's a most important survey for those of us that work with children because we can get important trends that are occurring as our nation changes. But on this survey, there are 5 questions that involve depression and suicide. And we've summarized the results on this slide. Almost 30% of the students that participated, and I would say that the sample is thousands of kids from all over the United States. And 30% answered yes to the question, did you feel so sad or hopeless for a period of 2 weeks or more where you stopped doing some of your normal activities? That's 30%. So for the typical educator, if you've got 20 kids in your class, according to these statistics, 6 of them, 4 girls and 2 boys, don't see any reason to be there that day for reading, math, and spelling. Okay? That's probably 7, 8, 9 on their top 10 list of things to do for the day. For these 6 students, they are in school probably because of the connectedness that they experience at school between their peers and their teachers. They also come to school because it's the safest place. So very often, teachers realize that kids are attending, they have higher priorities because of the risk factors that exist in their life. In this sample, almost 18% reported seriously considering suicide over the past year, and almost 15% had actually gone as far as making a plan. I think one of the most impactful statistics they ask on this survey is, over the past year, have you attempted suicide 1 or more times? And it may be shocking to hear that 9% answered yes to that question. The interesting thing about this statistic is, if you take a look, only 3% actually got to help after attempting suicide. So one of the most enlightening statistics is that 1 out of 3 who attempt suicide actually get to medical help. 2 out of 3 kids get up and go to school the next day. So it's essential to know the incidents, and particularly for educators to know the warning signs and risk factors. And we have to educate our students that if they are concerned about a friend of theirs, that there are 2 very important factors. Never keep, your concern about your friend confidential. Never keep a secret. And always tell a trusted adult. So once again, when these thoughts go to thoughts of suicide, it could be the result of untreated depression. Let's take a look at some of the warning signs for youth suicide, which is a theme to all of the modules that we put out. At the very top of the list, suicide notes or social media posts. I know now that there's a tremendous amount of concern of what kids post on Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat and Twitter. So it is so prevalent that an organization like Facebook has now provided some support to its users, so that if you are concerned about a comment that's placed on Facebook, you can actually reach out to Facebook, and they will get back to you in terms of how to proceed. They will ask you if you want to if you know the person on the wall or the comment, if you want to reach out to them, then they will provide some materials for you. But if you do not want to reach out, Facebook will follow through. So social media is coming along, and that's one of the new frontiers of certainly crisis intervention in the schools. Threats about suicide. Sometimes these threats can be direct. I want to die. I am going to kill myself. Or sometimes they can be indirect. The world would be better without me. Nobody would miss me anyway. I won't be back after summer vacation. Very important for teachers to take these kinds of comments very seriously. Giving away prized possessions or making a will, making final arrangements. I had a 17-year-old student once give away her 3-month-old child at the gate of the school, saying, you know, I want the baby's godmother to raise my child after I'm gone, because my mother has had her hands filled with me all of these years. Now think of the person to whom that child was handed to. You know, without training, that person may say, this child's adorable, you're young, you have everything to live for, now cut it out, stop talking silly. But in this particular case, because our security guard was trained, recognized this as a very serious warning sign and referred that student immediately. Evidence, particularly for teachers, evidence of written and work samples. I know that many teachers will take home their journals during the course of grading their day, the papers that they collected that day. And at night, sometimes they may read in these journals some suicidal thoughts or behaviors. I always recommend to teachers, you need to have an avenue to make that report immediately. So if you are home reviewing journals, make sure to take your emergency cards home as well, so that you, because I know after years and years of taking calls from teachers that no teacher is going to get sleep that night if they read a journal that is filled with suicidal thoughts. So to be able to take some action. And this is the part of the training, you know, for teachers that is extremely important. It is now not enough to just know risk factors and warning signs, but to also take some kind of action, some kind of positive action to prevent the suicide. And very important is exposure to suicide. As suicides occur in a community, risk rises amongst everyone. And what's interesting is the research shows you don't even have to know the person that died by suicide, but just know that a suicide occurred, and it will raise risk in everyone in the community. So what can schools do? What can your school do? We talk, Scott and I talk a lot about creating a circle of care around a student. Very often a troubled student may have a doctor, a community agency that provides counseling or support service. They have their home community. They have their church community or synagogue community. And they have their school community. And very often the communication is thwarted. So we have to, Scott and I promote all the time, we need to be talking about this more. We understand the nature of confidentiality and parents wanting to keep certain information private. But it's very important to talk to all the people in the immediate circle of care that surrounds the child, including the teacher, because very often the teacher is excluded, but including the teacher, so that they can be aware of looking for any changes in behavior, be able to support that student during the course of the day. So if a teacher is concerned about a student, they should offer to consult immediately with the school psychologist, social worker, counselor, or school nurse to access school resources. It is important for, at the beginning of every year, that school site crisis teams review all the resources in their community and make sure that those counseling agencies are still there providing those kinds of services. So often those agencies are now Starbucks. Pretty soon Starbucks will take over everything. However, community agencies change every year, so we need to maintain those relationships so that we can collaborate. And of course, it's always very important for the school to obtain a release of information from a parent so that we can facilitate this process of creating a circle of care. So in conclusion, for the educator, first thing, Do not be afraid to talk to your student about their thoughts, their suicidal thoughts. The fear is that you would be putting ideas in their head, and in reality, the research shows just the opposite, that the more students talk, the less anxiety they feel. Know the risk factors and warning signs like we've just reviewed. Know the referral process, and the most important thing for a teacher is to refer immediately and not actually send the child down to the office, but to have that child escorted by an adult so that you can be sure that the student, what we often do is tell the teacher, you escort the child to the crisis team, because it's very important that you join the crisis team and provide your valuable feedback. But we do realize that in many classrooms, the teacher is the only adult and would be impossible to leave the classroom. So a simple phone call down to the office, arranging, sometimes our teachers would use code S, which means please send an adult to escort a child down to the school psychologist, counselor, social worker, or nurse. I think it is particularly important when a student starts a round of medication as an intervention that teachers, particularly the first period teacher, know that the student has started a course of medication, because that circle of care must now monitor that student for at least the next 6 weeks on a regular basis to notice any changes in behavior and provide some important feedback to the doctor who is prescribing some kinds of medication. Now we're going to talk a little bit about current issues, and I'm going to refer back to Dr. Poland.
Thank you very much, Rich. Indeed, my pleasure to have a chance to talk with you a little bit more. We've been talking about the warning signs of depression, about the importance of educators knowing what to look for, knowing what to do. And I believe strongly that one of the greatest protective factors for a young person is to have that sense of connection at school. And what I truly hope is that every single student feels like somebody cares whether he or she comes to school today or not. And that every student has one or more trusted adults at school that they are comfortable going to about whatever might be going on, and especially if they are in fact depressed. And we want teachers that are comfortable talking with students privately about what's really going on in their lives. And maybe not every teacher would be comfortable doing that, but as Rich has been discussing, it's really important that they make that referral to the counseling office, that that student be walked down to the counselor, the social worker, or the school psychologist. One of our other challenges in our schools is to know the best resources that are available out in the community. There have actually been a number of national task forces that have basically determined many social workers, counselors, family therapists, and psychologists are not actually trained in suicide assessment and management. A few states are starting to require suicide assessment and management training for continuing licensure for personnel like psychologists, social workers, and counselors. So the main point of this is that if we're making a referral to the community, we are hopefully referring to somebody that we know is well trained, that has worked well with our school before, that has worked with our student, and has worked with our families. And we should not hesitate to make that referral. Frustration I've had is sometimes school psychologists, counselors, and social workers will tell me, in our school we were told we cannot make referrals for private services. We have students that are depressed and maybe even suicidal. We certainly need to continue to do supportive things at school, but we also need to refer to those private practitioners and community mental health center services that are available in our community. It's also very important to talk with the teenager and the parent about the importance of sharing information. And most of the time, that school mental health person, they'll ask, but I'm going to go a little bit beyond that. I think we need to ask more than once. We need to be persuasive. We need to explain clearly, how can I actually help your child the best as the school counselor, school psychologist? if I can freely and easily talk to that private provider. Another frustration I've heard from those school mental health providers is that it's all over school that the student was depressed and made a suicide attempt and has now been hospitalized for the last 4 days. But the parents came in and told me that no, in fact, she is suffering from mono. That's why she's been hospitalized. And the more the parents will be truthful with us, the more we can share and partner with those private practitioners. And at the same time, we of course need to let the parents know that we're going to keep this information confidential. We're not going to be trying to explain why your child made a suicide attempt. We're not going to be talking about your family history. We're simply going to be alert for further warning signs. And a question I get very often is, as the counselor, if I know a kid is depressed and suicidal, am I able to alert the classroom teachers? I personally believe we're talking about an emergency situation. We need to treat all the teachers as fellow professionals. We're not going to be giving them a great deal of information. We're never going to be talking about why the student is so depressed, but we need to alert them. So if that young person writes a poem about suicide, if that young person is in the library checking out books about suicide, we want that personnel to simply let us know so we can follow up as the school counselor, social worker, or school psychologist. We do in fact need carefully planned units on depression and warning signs of suicide presented to students. Now the bottom line is I'm often asked, what about at the elementary level? Well, we really don't have very many programs at the elementary level that actually has as the target audience students. At the same time, I'm increasingly aware of more elementary students, 4th and 5th grade, that are depressed, and I'm aware of a number of suicides in that population as well. But most of our curriculum units focus on middle school and high school, and they can be very effective. I want to quickly describe one scenario in my previous district. The young man had broken up with his girlfriend. He was not taking pride in appearance. He was drinking a lot. He was using some other drugs. And his previous girlfriend couldn't quite put her finger on it, but she was really worried about him. He was driving recklessly. He wasn't taking pride in his appearance. He wasn't actually in the high school classes very much. Finally, she felt compelled to go open up his locker. She had the combination. She found the suicide note. It was addressed to her, saying something like, "Dear Cheryl, it's not your fault. Don't blame yourself. I'm going to kill myself this afternoon. Go on and have the best life you possibly can." Signed, Tom. Now, the literature says really clearly that many times young people hesitate. They think, I'll call him later. I'll check on him. Oh, if he's not better in a couple of days, maybe I would think about contacting an adult. But as a result of that curriculum unit, Cheryl knew better than to delay. Now she's in the counseling office. The door to the counselor she needs to see is closed. She's knocking on the door. She's not waiting and taking a number. Counselor comes out, sees the panic on her face, reads the note, says, "Cheryl, come with me." Now they're in the principal's office. The principal said, "We're going to search the school. We're going to find him." Tom is nowhere on the school grounds. Now that principal could have said, "We'll check on it tomorrow." Instead, he turned to Cheryl and said, "You must know where he lives." Turned to an assistant and said, "Call the dad. Tell dad we're going to his home." And also, I was called. I was one of the people that arrived at Tom's home maybe minutes after he got there. All I can tell you is he had a clearly thought out plan about how he was going to die by suicide. And in my example, obviously Cheryl did the most. Cheryl was his friend, his classmate, his former girlfriend. She did the most because somebody actually talked to her at school about what to look for, what to do. Don't keep a secret. You know, at the simplest level, one of Rich and I's recommendations would be for the school to form a task force focusing on depression and suicide. And that task force will be the most effective when it involves community members. Schools can't solve the problem of depression and youth suicide by themselves. They need to be linking with local and state resources. They need to be collaborating with local mental health, the local group of physicians, the local group of ministers and faith leaders, everybody working together on this problem. It's also very important that we spend a few minutes today talking about bullying and suicide. Very pleased to tell you that we've already done a module for the Jason Foundation about bullying and suicide. A number of parents believe strongly that the suicide of their child was primarily the result of bullying. They've actually sued schools, saying, "We told you our child was being bullied at school. You didn't do anything about it, and tragedy was the result." Well, what does the literature and the research say? And this is one of the most researched current topics going on in our country. The research says clearly there is a strong association between bullying and suicide. It does not say there is a causal relationship. It would be almost impossible to rule out other factors, most importantly, mental illness, maybe being the victim of physical or sexual abuse, not being cared for in your family and valued and appreciated, or maybe even living in poverty. But we do need to recognize that child that's being bullied could be depressed, could feel that things are hopeless, and could become suicidal. The main message is, when you know the child is the victim of bullying, as a school person, as an educator, do not hesitate to ask them about thoughts of hopelessness, giving up, and not wanting to live anymore. One of the cases I'm really involved in, I just want to describe the middle school student for you for just a moment. Everybody who knew him said he was really small for his age. He was pale. He was frail. He had a bad skin rash on his face. He spoke funny because he had a lisp. He walked funny, and he identified as gay and Buddhist. By the way, what do you think life would be like in a large middle school for the young man that I just described? Can you also figure out which class in middle school would be the most challenging for him, maybe even the most torturous? And I imagine you're immediately thinking about physical education. And I want to be fair to PE teachers and coaches. When you have 50 or 60 students at one time, it's pretty hard to develop a close relationship with all of them and to supervise them at every single moment. But tragedy was the result in that situation. We have great documentation that 1 out of every 4 students in America is bullied with some repetitive nature on a regular basis. So I would argue that the young man I described to you should have stood out as the 1 kid in 100 most likely to be bullied and harassed at school. And as we start talking about lesbian, bisexual, gay, and transgender youth, I want to be honest. Working in schools for 26 years, I readily admit we did not do enough to protect this population. Thankfully, this population is very much on the national agenda today. And I compliment the Jason Foundation because we are also doing another module on LGBTQ. But for the purposes today, we need to all recognize this group is much more likely to have attempted suicide, 8 times more likely than their heterosexual peers. They're much more likely to have a high level of depression than their heterosexual peers. In fact, 6 times more likely. The Family Acceptance Project basically says, what is the single greatest protective factor for a gay youth in our country? Acceptance from their family. Unfortunately, sometimes they are totally rejected from their family. A teacher that I know well, a teacher who's an outstanding educator and person, told me recently that his father has not spoken to him for 22 years. He is dead to his father because of his sexual orientation. The Trevor Project is an excellent resource. School interventions for depression. You've heard a little bit about some of this already. We obviously believe that all schools need a crisis team that works on prevention and intervention, and sadly, if a tragedy happens, they also work on postvention. Postvention is another module that we are doing for the Jason Foundation. We need policies and procedures in our schools. We need to know what to look for, what to do. I believe strongly we need annual training on the warning signs of depression and suicide. Where I used to work, though, it wasn't unusual for a principal to say, "Oh, come on, Scott, you talked to the high school staff last year about this subject. Surely you don't need to do it again." Well, how many new staff members do you have this year? Other times, some of the school psychologists who worked for me would come back to the office and say, "The middle school principal did let me talk about depression and suicide, but he gave me all of 8 minutes." So we obviously need to spend more time, and we need annual training, which thankfully is now required in a number of our states. Gatekeeper training. That is what most youth suicide prevention is, and it's very important. What is gatekeeper training? That is when we talk to the adults about what to look for, what to do, how to identify a depressed and suicidal student, and how to get services for them. It's really extremely important. But the bottom line is kids say things to each other that the adults are never going to know about and they're never going to hear. That's why I think it's so important that we look at programs that provide young people with clear information about how to help yourself, how to help your friend. Here are the resources that are available to you. Very promising, coming really only in the last decade, is depression screening. This is done very carefully. It's done in small groups. Parental permission is a part of this process. Young people answer questions about energy level, joy of life, thoughts of depression and suicide, and they can turn over that depression screening form, score it, and immediately know whether they need to see a mental health professional today or not. I've already stressed that partnership and collaboration between the school, the community, local and state resources. Often we have young people that are re-entering school. They've been out because of depression or maybe even suicide attempts. We need to have a re-entry meeting as quickly as possible. And obviously we would have hoped that the school personnel reached out to them when they were home because of their depression, or visited them in the hospital if that's where they were because of their depression and suicidal thoughts. Preparing them to come back to school, sitting around the table with the student and their parents, looking at ways that we can support them and coordinate with their family and that private provider. And yes, maybe even looking at lessening academic expectations right now. Can you imagine if you were out of school in a high-achieving school for more than a week, how much homework and missed assignments there might be? And if the expectation is you've got to have that all done in 2 days, that would add yet another stressor. So a re-entry meeting would address all those issues: emotional support and academic support. And it would really include safety planning. How can you keep yourself safe? How can we help you? Who can you call? What can you do if you have these extreme thoughts of depression and suicide? Depression is treatable. That might be the most important thing that we could possibly say in this module today. There are excellent treatments that occur. And when a young person dies by suicide, I usually think of it as untreated or undertreated mental illness. And our challenge is to provide the right treatment. Medications, most commonly the antidepressants, the SSRIs, psychotherapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, and working in a doctoral program where the students do a lot of therapy and they have to present the cases to us. If we look at Aaron Beck and his work on depression, he focused a lot on negative schema, most usually that go all the way back to early childhood. And how can we stop the automatic thoughts that a depressed person often has about, I'm going to be overwhelmed, I'm not going to be able to handle this, I'm not very good, I'm not a good person. So cognitive behavioral therapy works on addressing all of those issues. And dialectical behavior therapy, yes, it involves the traditional talk therapy, but it also involves social skills training, maybe even twice a week. It involves things like mindfulness, yoga, relaxation. And the one thing about DBT is the therapist is supposed to be available by phone. So it's not just my appointment's Tuesday at 4 o'clock. I need to talk to my therapist today. And I call them up and I hopefully get some good information. There's also a lot of research that has to do with light and light therapy and melatonin. This is particularly important in states where people may suffer from seasonal affective disorder because of, in the middle of the winter, there's hardly ever any daylight. And exercise is incredibly important for young people. We talked about non-suicidal self-injury as a coping mechanism, but wouldn't we really like to see those young people engaging in regular exercise and releasing endorphins naturally, as opposed to releasing them through purposeful, moderate, superficial cutting and burning? Faith, prayer, mindfulness, all very important in today's world. Now, you're probably very familiar with antidepressants with adolescents has received some criticism. Going back to the warning from the Federal Drug Advisory Board, I believe in the year 2005. There is now a black diamond warning on antidepressants for adolescents. Many of us that have looked at the research believe that advisory was maybe a little too strong in terms of the caution, because those medications potentially could help many depressed adolescents. It's also ironic to look at the suicide rate for adolescents has actually gone up dramatically in the now 11 years since that black diamond warning. Many parents will simply, totally without a lot of information or maybe no information at all, rule out the possibility that their depressed child might benefit from medication. We're always going to be for a careful diagnosis. We're always going to be for that medication being monitored carefully by the physician. In fact, I'm going to recommend your child starts on medication, see the doctor every week for at least 6 weeks until we know that the medication is helpful and does not have harmful side effects. As a psychologist, it is so often that the parent says, we tried an antidepressant, we didn't like it, we stopped. I'm always going to say, have you discussed that with the prescribing physician? At least go back and talk with them about the medication, and there are certainly others that could be tried. So I believe strongly that school personnel need to be able to discuss medication with families and just let them know about the potential benefits and encourage them to talk to their physician about those medications. So depression is treatable. Need to repeat that again. We've talked about counseling, we've talked about psychotherapy, how important it is to provide that. When I worked full-time in the schools, I had individual counseling regularly with students. I had group counseling with students. Many times when I was aware that the student was depressed, I would put them in my counseling group. So I had a chance to interact with them on a weekly basis. I would always remind them of the safety plan, of the crisis hotline numbers. And the question really is, how do we end the stigma that we have in this country about mental illness? When are we actually going to view mental illness the same way that we view all of those other medical conditions, and make sure that everyone receives the proper treatment? Making it okay to seek help. It's not a weakness. It's not saying there's something wrong with the child, there's something wrong with the family. We've got to get help. Couple of national resources, and we do have the 2012 National Strategies for Suicide Prevention. We have the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. 1-800-SUICIDE, doesn't matter where you are in this country, you are connected. 1-800-273-TALK. Very important that all of our young people know those warning signs. Know how to help themselves, how to help their friends, know who to call. And again, Rich and I are very pleased to be a part of the Jason Foundation and their multiple modules on depression, suicide prevention, and related topics. And we sincerely believe the Jason Foundation is leading the way in this country to stop youth suicides. Thank you very much.